This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Hannah Feldman. Steve Skrovan is off this week, so I'm here with my co-host, David Feldman. Hi, David.
Good morning.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. A gripping show.
Yes, today's guest will be Dr. Michael Osterholm. He's the director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, and he's joining us on the program again to talk about the COVID pandemic. Dr. Osterholm has actually been talking to us about the COVID pandemic since before we even had a COVID pandemic. He was on way back in 2018, and he rang the alarm about the threat of killer germs and the inevitability of a deadly pandemic. Turns out he might be right. And he warned us that unless we took that threat seriously, when that pandemic did eventually come, it could be catastrophic. Then in spring 2020, he joined us to talk us through the early days of COVID-19, when all signs indicated that this novel coronavirus could be that very pandemic he'd been warning us about. And most recently, in May 2022, after 2 long years of sanitizing and masking and quarantining and vaccinating and Omicron and Delta and new variant after new variant after new variant after new variant, he came on to remind us that despite our fatigue and how much we might all crave a return to normalcy, COVID was still very much a threat, especially to the most vulnerable among us. Now we're in 2024. We've lived with COVID for more than 4 years. Many of us certainly feel like we're done with the pandemic, at least emotionally. But is the pandemic actually done? Can we let our guard down, or do we still need to take precautions? Masking, testing frequently. Should we expect an annual COVID season, just like the flu season, with a new booster shot every year? And perhaps most importantly, are we ready for the next novel virus when it eventually comes along? Those are all questions, along with many others, that we'll ask Dr. Osterholm. Then, to close out the show, Ralph has an assignment for you. He wants you to tell President Biden what you think about the hero's welcome that Benjamin Netanyahu got in DC last month. We'll have details at the end of the show. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, it's time for our biannual checkup with Dr. Michael Osterholm. David?
Dr. Michael Osterholm is a professor and director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. In November 2020, Dr. Osterholm was appointed to President-elect Joe Biden's 13-member transition COVID-19 advisory board. He's the author of Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs, and he has a weekly podcast called The Osterholm Update, which offers discussion and analysis on the latest infectious disease developments. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Michael Osterholm.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Welcome back, Michael. Listeners, Michael's an old friend. He happens to be the most comprehensive communicator from the world of science on the coming pandemics and the continuing problem of COVID-19. So we're going to start, Michael, with the more immediate questions people have on their minds, because there's a new booster about to come on the market in a few days from Moderna and Pfizer and Novavax. And they have questions about it you can answer, and then we're going to talk about the long haul, and then we'll go into the rising fear of an avian flu influenza and the article you co-authored just a few days ago in the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs, saying the world and our country are woefully unprepared for the next pandemic. So let's start with this new booster and the variants. How effective and for how long do you think this new booster will be when people start taking it in September and onward?
As you pointed out, we do have 2 new vaccines, both mRNA vaccines, one by Pfizer, one by Moderna, that have been approved as of yesterday, will be available. To understand what vaccines and coronavirus infections means, you got to take a step back and realize that we really didn't have much information on coronavirus vaccines prior to COVID. We had the outbreaks with SARS in China and parts of the world in 2003. We had MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, in 2011, 12, 13. But on a whole, there was very little experience. So we didn't know what to expect with these new vaccines. Once we introduced them into the population, knew that there was a good safety profile for them, that they surely could provide protection, we had to learn that with coronavirus infections, somewhat like influenza, the protection waned over time. So that within 4 to 6 months, you saw that after a vaccination with one of these doses, or the 2-regimen dose, that you started to really lose the protection against even serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. Then on top of that, you had a very accelerated mutation situation going on, much more so than we see with influenza, where these new variants keep showing up. And these variants are basically evolved coronaviruses that are able to evade immune protection, meaning that they just know how to get around whatever we're trying to vaccinate against. Think about measles. You can vaccinate a child today, at age 2 for measles, and they're probably pretty darn good for life. Okay. With a coronavirus situation, you might be good for a few months. And so this really makes it a challenge for us. So what we've had to do is basically come up with an approach where I think ultimately every 4 to 6 months, we really do need an additional dose of vaccine. Now, I'm a realist. I know that's not going to happen. But today, for example, we are seeing about 725 deaths this week with COVID in the United States. Surely a lot less than the 20,000 deaths that occurred per week back during Omicron and some of the early Delta work. But at the same time, that's a lot of deaths anyway. And most of them are over age 65. Most have underlying immune conditions of some kind if they're under 65. And so I think what we're trying to do today is use this vaccine to target those high-risk people in particular, to say, you know what, you need to get it at least every 4 to 6 months. And that unlike flu vaccine, this is not going to be a once-a-year vaccine. And if you did that, by just reducing serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths, would be a big accomplishment.
Well, some people are viewing COVID and the surge during the summer as just like the common cold or just a mild flu. You disagree?
No, actually, I think for a lot of people, that is it. And that's the same challenge that we see with influenza. Every season we have a number of people that get sick that are out for a day or two and then back. They're feeling fine. But of course, we know that also, just like with COVID, you see that proportion of those, particularly older individuals, who get critically ill and die. And so one of the challenges we have is pursuing the prevention really of not infection, because we can't. These vaccines are not good at preventing you from getting infected or even from you transmitting the virus. But what they can do, which is critically important and why I always get my vaccine as soon as I can, they do really reduce the risk of serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish today. I would rather see everyone get a dose every 6 months. I'm a realist again, as I said. I know that won't happen. We still see deaths in kids. There are more kids dying from COVID yet in this country than are dying from flu. We do recommend every child get a flu shot every year. So why are we not doing the same with COVID? But at the overall picture of risk, it really is for those of us who are over 65 who have underlying immune conditions that are really at highest risk. So if, as I said at the beginning of the pandemic, I would be perfectly comfortable with everybody getting COVID twice a year in this country if it was nothing more than a common like cold illness. And we're not there yet, but I think the majority of COVID we see today are those kinds of cases. But then we still have that segment that we have to do whatever we can to reduce serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths.
And how about the long haul problem, which can be as high as 20% apparently?
This is a challenge. And the good news is, and it may be a combination of some acquired immunity, which is not fully protective against COVID, getting infected again, but it is protected against getting long COVID, as you noted. And we are seeing clearly reduced rates of long COVID in people who've previously been vaccinated. And that is by itself an important point. So, and long COVID can surely be a challenge. I became infected. The only time I've been infected was in March of 2023. And in that time period, I developed a long COVID picture for about 4 to 6 months where I was extremely fatigued. I had real memory issues. I would have been coming on the Paul Nader show. I wouldn't have remembered the difference kind of thing. It was a real challenge. And I can report that, over about 4 to 6 months, I fully recovered. I'm back to, I guess as good as I ever was. But it was a scary proposition. So you're absolutely right. And this is another reason why getting vaccine does reduce your likelihood of getting long COVID.
What about the testing issue? People are all confused. When should they test when they get preliminary symptoms? If you only have rapid tests, what should be the testing protocol for getting the best result? Can you advise people on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, you want to test because of the fact that depending on who you are, again, if you're one of those individuals at increased risk for serious illness, clearly you should take the drug Paxlovid. There's been a lot of misinformation about this drug. It does not cause rebound effects that some people think, where if I take it, I'll be sick, then get better, then get sick again. That happens with all people who have COVID, whether you're on Paxlovid or not. But we have clear and compelling data, particularly for those who are older, that Paxlovid will, in fact, greatly reduce your likelihood of developing serious illness, hospitalizations, and death. And so you want to know. You can't get a prescription for that if you're not, in fact, tested and found positive. So that's important to get for that reason. The second reason to get tested, and this is for all ages, is you should try to isolate yourself then as much as you can. Don't go to work. Don't go to school. Don't go to parties. Don't go out to eat, at least for 7 days after you've had onset of symptoms and in your test positive. Why? Because you don't want to transmit it to others. I've seen far too many situations where, grandpa and grandma just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The whole family's there. One of the grandkids is sick, but they don't want to miss the party. And then they go to the party and they infect everybody else there, including grandpa and grandma, who now have really rough courses of illness. So you want to test for that reason, too, to isolate yourself. Now, one of the questions is how available are tests today? And that's a challenge. And we're trying to work on that issue. The funding that originally came through the CDC from the U.S. government to support testing has basically evaporated. Now testing is being largely handled by your healthcare provider. And a number of people do not have healthcare providers that will pay for these tests. So this is a challenge. We've got to address that issue. But again, I think it's important to get the testing for two reasons. Again, to take Paxlovid, particularly for those who are older, underlying immune deficiency illnesses, and so that I don't want to infect others in my immediate circle.
Well, how long are these test kits that you get through the post office and the U.S. government good for?
Well, the problem is you don't get them anymore. They're done. They dried up. You now have to go to your pharmacy, and hopefully you have healthcare insurance that will cover the cost of these reimbursed. So this is a problem with that. And there is an effort ongoing right now at CDC to identify money, cover both vaccine and testing. But as of this point right now, there unfortunately are a number of people who will have to pay out of pocket for this testing, and some of it can be remarkably expensive.
Aren't they good for beyond the expiration date on the label?
That's what's going to go next. The thing is that there is an expiration date on these. In some cases, that expiration date has automatically been moved back. So check. There's a product code on the box. Check, use that product code, to actually learn what the new expiration date might be. So your box might say August 2024, and it's actually been extended now to March of 2025. That's number one. Number two, even if you get a box that's expired, it's better to use that to test with than if you're not going to test at all. And you'll just know that there's a possibility you may have a false negative, meaning that you really are positive, but it doesn't pick it up in the test. But the best data we have right now says that doesn't happen often. So I would clearly tell people, don't throw them out, use them, and they may be very helpful yet in telling you whether you're infected or not.
Let's look at the percentage of people who do take the booster and the problem there. And people often ask about any discovered side effects that are significant. And are you worried that the clinical tests by Moderna and Pfizer are involving fewer and fewer people? They started out with almost 4,000 people, double-blind tests. Cuba has much larger double-blind tests participants, but now they're down under 800. Does that bother you at all?
Well, it doesn't, in the sense that the initial testing was as much about safety as well as how do they work. And that you never have enough. Even 4,000 is still a challenge. And because the real testing will come when it's finally available to the general public. And we recognize that. That's why we have vaccine safety programs in place to do follow-up. Once that's happened like that, the testing we do now is to make sure that you get a good immune response. It's just like flu vaccine. We change those vaccines out for almost every year to the most current strain that's circulating out there. And we don't go back and, do the original efficacy test on it. We look to see serologically or in the blood, how good is the response we get from those vaccines. And so I think at this point, keeping our safety profile programs, our surveillance in place is very important. But the key feature we're looking for right now is, because it's the very same vaccine, just a slightly different antigen, is we're looking to see, in fact, how well does it work from causing you to develop an immune response, as opposed to, is it about safety? And by the way, when you think about this vaccine, there's been no other vaccine in modern history that has been taken up by more people than COVID. I mean, you think back to 2020, think of the millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people who have been vaccinated. So in many ways, we've actually had more experience with the COVID vaccines, both pre and post licensure, than virtually any other vaccine out there.
Well, the last booster last fall, was under 50% of adults decided to take it. What's going on here? And tell us about the budget constraints on CDC in terms of the COVID before we go to the avian flu.
Sure. Well, the world has moved on. I mean, I think that this is clearly a study not only in immunology, meaning the immune response, but it's also a study in the sociology of infection and a vaccine. And today, most people said, I'm over this. I'm done. I just got off a plane yesterday from San Francisco to Minneapolis that had gone out the previous 2 days. And there were very, very, very few people who had any kind of respiratory protection on, even those who might have been well over 65. And obviously, they had made a decision in their own world that they didn't need that anymore, even though we're seeing this big spike in cases. And I think this is the challenge we have, is people trying to understand risk. What triggers certain behavior changes with risk? And I know it's a challenge. We're going to continue to see less and less in terms of people getting vaccinated. And unfortunately, that will result in what I just said, 725 deaths last week in this country from COVID. And how do you get people to rationalize and internalize risk? We all get in cars every day. And you, of all people, know this one so well, Ralph, is, car safety surely has improved a lot, but it's not, zero. And so the challenge is, at what point do people feel comfortable doing or not doing something to protect their health? And I worry that there are people who could protect their health today by getting vaccinated who are not going to do that.
What's your advice on masks inside and outside? It seems a modest inconvenience, but a lot of people resist it. You just have to look at airplane passengers.
Yeah, you're right. No, you're 100% right. In fact, in this week's podcast that I did, I actually cover the concept not just of respiratory protection. That's the physics. We know how to do that. We know how to provide you a mask that can really reduce transmission dramatically. But it's actually the study of sociology that's more important. Why do people just not agree to use them? Why? And there's any number of reasons, and it's going to take somebody a heck of a lot smarter than me to try to figure out, how do you motivate people and why? And they'll say, well, it's my risk. I smoke because I want to. It's my risk, okay? I don't wear a mask because I don't want to. Now, for many people, I can understand if you look at their big portfolio of risk, COVID is low in that risk picture for dying, for being seriously ill. Doesn't mean they won't get infected. But again, it comes back to the point that we've been talking about. There is a subsection of our group in this country, over 65 years of age, people who have actually had underlying immune conditions. They should be in times like this. We're seeing as much activity right now with COVID virus, at least, as we saw in some of the big waves that we had in the heart of the pandemic itself. The good news, again, is it's less serious illness, but it's still illness. So, people are just voting with their own decision making to say, I'm not going to wear a mask.
Let's go to the avian flu situation, which seems to be coming out of Colorado, infecting cows, infecting more farm hands. The CDC doesn't know how widely the virus has spread. They're worried about it mutating, jumping to human beings, giving it from human beings to human beings. And you're quite worried about this. And the New York Times quotes a lot of specialists recently in an article saying we may have missed the boat here. We may have not reacted in time, meaning the CDC, the Biden administration, state departments of public health. What's your view of this that's coming from birds, and they're now slaughtering huge numbers of chickens? It's gotten into the cows. It's gotten into some of the milk. Give us your update on that. Are you worried?
Yeah, well, let me provide an overview to kind of set the stage for what we need to think about today. All influenza viruses that ultimately become human viruses originate in avian species, birds, and they attach to cells using a very specific site on the cell. And that happens to be for avian viruses what we call a 2,3 receptor. Now, human infections, which are these evolved viruses, require what we call a 2,6 receptor. That's important. It's like two different keys for two totally different locks. And our concern has always been when you get a bird virus that might set up in a species that has receptor sites for both in their lungs. And pigs are one of the species that does that. And so you heard about swine flu. You've heard about this issue where what happens if I get co-infected with a bird virus and a human virus at the same time, they get together, swap genes, and create a whole new virus. And when that happens, that's when you're likely to see a pandemic where we don't have immunity to that virus and it takes off. Now, in 1996, H5N1 was found to kill a number of birds in China and Southeast Asia. And at that point, it was a very unusual outbreak, but it seemed to kind of more or less really die down shortly after it showed up. But then in 1997, there was an outbreak in a market in Hong Kong. And at that point, everything was done basically to try to eliminate the birds sold in the market as the source, including killing large numbers in the farms of the Guangdong province that supplied Hong Kong. Well, everyone said, we saved the world from a pandemic because it disappeared, only to show back up again in about 2002. And now it was in Indonesia, it was in Malaysia, it was in Vietnam, it was in Thailand. And I actually worked on it in those countries at that time. And we saw about 110 to 130 cases of H5N1 in humans, meaning that somehow it was still crossing into humans in a limited way, even though, again, primary receptor sites were these 2,3 receptors for birds. Well, we all said, we're ready for a pandemic. This is going to happen. And, 2005 came, 2006, the case numbers just continued to dwindle. Well, then at 2012, I, at that time, was a member of the National Science Advisory Board on Biosecurity, a federal organization that basically tried to help oversee the safety of laboratory work in this country and around the world. And we had two very prominent flu researchers come to visit us and share that their research said H5N1 is ready to blow. We're one or two mutations away from a new pandemic strain. They had data on ferrets, infections, et cetera. We're all sitting there on the edge of our seats, with our nails literally grinding into the metal seat. And you know what? All of a sudden, it just kind of died down, even fewer cases. And then 2015 showed up, and 150 duck farmers in the Nile River Valley got infected. Half of them died. We said, here it goes again. It's going to go. And nothing happened. The last 7 years have actually been the lowest number of cases in humans that we've seen since the emergence back in 1997. But what has happened, this new strain of H5N1 is now affecting birds on a much more widespread basis, and it's now into certain mammals. We're seeing over 40 different mammal species that have become infected. But if you look at what's happened more specifically, and the point you were just asking about, is it turned out that we learned in March of infections in dairy cattle in the panhandle of Texas. And this was picked up by a various veterinarian who didn't know what it was, but knew it was something different, sent off test results and found out it was H5N1. And it turns out these cows were basically getting infected largely in the udder, not in the respiratory tract. And it was likely transmission from a contaminated milk source when you were milking the cow, and then the next cow came in, that same equipment was used and infected them through the udder. Now, how did the first infection happen? It's not surprising because wild birds feed all the time in the same feed troughs that the cattle feed in. So if a bird had it, it wouldn't be surprising it got into the cow. Now, what happened after that? Well, cattle were moved. The dairy industry in this country is very complicated, and many of the new animals they bring into a dairy herd are actually raised in places like northern Texas and then shipped out after a year or two to the dairy farms. And in such, we know that cattle were shipped to at least 13 states where we've seen cases. And to date, right now, we have 192 different herds in 13 states that have had this infection. It's in the udder. The animals, you can tell immediately because the milk becomes very discolored. The animal shows a febrile illness. Happy to report that they appear to recover largely. And in fact, if you look at the different states, Colorado leads the country right now in number of farms affected at 65. And of those already, we've seen that 21 have now gotten rid of the virus out of their farm. So they're back in full order. So what's happening? Well, there's a hell of a lot more than 13 states that have this. But there's no legal authority to require these states to test the milk from cattle. Colorado was one state that put their own requirement into place. They did have legal authority. And as soon as they did that, they found 10 brand new farms that were positive that nobody ever knew about or reported before because the bulk tank ended up showing the virus. So let me just say that at this point, the big concern we have is, will we see workers who are infected with seasonal viruses this winter working in the dairy milking area and the cattle still having H5N1, and then we get a virus in the udder of that cow, which now we've learned, like pig lungs, they have receptors for both the 2.6 and the 2.3 viruses in their udder. We didn't know that until just this spring. And so we're worried that could a new virus spin out of there, and we just don't know. What could be done here? I can say that I have exhaustively looked at this issue, as have some of my colleagues. The USDA does not have the authority to actually make all of these farmers throughout the United States test their milk, their bulk tank testing. States have that authority in their Department of Agriculture, but very few states would be ever willing to do that because the farm community doesn't want it. And so I think at this point, we're flying blind. And I think one of the quotes you might be talking about that I had in the New York Times was where I said, wishful thinking is not always the right answer. And we're just hoping that this is going to go away, but we don't know. So the challenge we have finally is about the workers. And this is where CDC has been criticized, and I must say unfairly. For a CDC to come into any state, they have to be invited by the state. That's actually a very unique issue of states' rights issues. But on top of that, the state has to have permission to go on the farms. Well, most of these farms, particularly the larger dairy operations, are populated, and thank God, by undocumented workers. And I say thank God because if they didn't do it, nobody else would. And you don't have to pick apples every day. You don't have to do a lot of things, but you got to milk that cow twice a day or you got in big trouble. So one of the concerns we've had is many of the undocumented workers have actually run for the hills as soon as they had any sense that there might be a federal or state agency wanting to talk to them. And this is part of our mess we have in this country for undocumented workers. Thank God we have them, or we wouldn't have an agricultural industry right now. But at the same time, it's made it impossible for public health to often interview and get blood samples from these people and follow up. To date, there have been 13 cases of illness. All of them are eye infections. Humans have in their eye the 2.3 receptor. So that it's not surprising we'd see eye infections, but none of them have had classic influenza, in the lungs, suggestive that there's transmission there. So is this going to be another example like the history I just gave you for H5N1 over the last 20 some years? I don't know. Could it turn out to be the cause of the next pandemic? It might. But I think that's where we're at this unsettled time right now of trying to understand. So this was a long-winded answer, Ralph, but I hope it gives you a kind of an idea of just how complicated this issue is.
Let's go to a segue. We're talking with Dr. Michael Osterholm, the University of Minnesota. let's go to the segue that you outlined in great detail in the Foreign Affairs article that came out on August 15th of this year. And I want to read a key paragraph because what you are recommending is a level of governmental, social, civic organization that we're not used to in this country. I mean, just think of whether to keep the kids in school and out of school. Most people say, I don't want my kid to stay out of school, even though the child tested positive, say. Well, they're not cued in that it's not just the family that's at stake here. It's contaging other families. And it's all a community effort instead of an individual freedom effort. And the level of monetary resources is pathetic. The World Health Organization budget is equivalent in dollars to the revenue of one large hospital in the United States. The Centers for Disease Control budget is less than what the Congress war-whooped an additional $14 billion to Israel to further its weaponization of the genocide in Gaza. And you make a very powerful analogy with the military here. And here's the paragraph I want to read from your article. Quote, the price tag for such measures will be high, and not all the investment will pay dividends. But a new pandemic could prove far more deadly or costly than a new war. And governments rarely shy away from spending whatever is deemed necessary on new and better weapons. Biological security is just as important as military security. And the United States needs to accept the idea that it would be going to war against a microbial enemy potentially far more dangerous than any conceivable human foe, end quote. So you're trying to galvanize the world with a very comprehensive proposal from your base at the University of Minnesota. And I think our listeners would like your description of it. And listeners, don't be overwhelmed by the number of steps and stages that have to be instituted here. We have very complex supply chains for relatively trivial consumer products spanning the globe of mind-blowing complexity. And this is what we have to reorient our society all the way from the budgets to the strategies to the scientists to the community level of organization and to the human psychology here. Because you're not saying if we have a pandemic, you're saying it is not if, it is when. And you're actually saying that this pandemic, sooner or later, from the influenza, avian flu, is going to happen. So tell us about your comprehensive approach here in terms of vaccine development, but also in terms of far more fundamental preventive care in the interaction between nations, such as China and the United States.
Well, thank you, Ralph. You really laid that out very nicely. Let me back up and remind everyone that actually, my interest and concern about pandemics and what they could do to humans actually has been something present in much of my career, my 50 years in public health. But in fact, in 2005, when, as I was discussing earlier about the H5N1 activity in Southeast Asia, I had a very unusual opportunity. I convinced the Journal of Foreign Affairs, New England Journal of Medicine, and the science magazine Nature to publish on the same day in 2005 the same article for me. So it wasn't copycat plagiarism. They all agreed. I laid out at that time this very same argument that almost is word for word what you just cited is in the current foreign affairs piece. And do you think that anybody really took that seriously? No. I mean, it just didn't happen. And so from that perspective, I've continued to pursue it. In the 2017 book, Deadliest Enemies, the one that you cited that I wrote, I laid out what a pandemic of influenza would look like and talking about how it lasts 3 years or more and what it would mean in terms of all of society. And ironically, the coronavirus pandemic unfolded just like that, is you could just substitute the word coronavirus or SARS for influenza. Again, nobody really wanted to pay attention to that. And so I find ourselves today looking at what we should have learned through the pandemic. And the last time you had me on, Ralph, we actually talked about the need for a panel to actually do a post-pandemic review. not to point fingers, not to blame people, but what should we have learned from that pandemic? And what I think is for me still a real challenge is we haven't seemed to learn through any of this, but more importantly, we haven't realized what happened with COVID could be child's play compared to what we could see if this was anything like a 1918 like pandemic of influenza. And mind you that this is not about having better health care today, because this virus in 1918, an H1N1 flu virus, killed by basically having this overvigorous immune response for which we can't treat any better today than we did in 1918, really. And so the challenge we have today is helping people understand we could have a much more catastrophic event from all aspects of medicine, society, governance, business that could be so disruptive. So wouldn't you think we'd want to invest in this? We are using today, Ralph, virtually almost the same technology to make flu vaccine that we did in 1940. Now, that should wake everyone up. We have vaccines against flu and coronaviruses. And as I said earlier, they're good vaccines, but they're not great. They don't have durable protection. You have to wait till you get the actual infecting virus before you can start making the vaccine. And we have almost no capacity to make them. And so in that article, I laid out all of those issues. And we at CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, which I lead, are actually the organization for the world in keeping track of flu vaccine research and coronavirus vaccine research. We call these roadmaps. And we track all the research out there. We can track the budgets. We can tell you how much institutions, organizations, private sector are investing in this. And this past year, we had just a little over $1 billion invested in this, okay? Now, we know we can make better vaccines, or we should say we believe we can make better vaccines over time, ones that could have durable protection, ones that could actually be given as a vaccine early in life and still have that protection like measles 20 years later. That imagine if the pandemic emerges, but you got most of your population immune. I mean, you would have dodged a war. You would have dodged a pandemic. And how do you get people to invest in that? Our vaccine research investment today is almost, it's a biannual kind of issue, a 2-year budget. When the military decides, the Navy decides to build a new aircraft carrier, they put in place a 14-year program, that's funded through the duration. And they know they're going to have problems where they have to go back and redo things. They add additional money in. We don't have any of that kind of insight at all for these vaccines. On top of that, we have almost no capacity to manufacture them. I know we're going to cover in a moment Mpox, the whole issue with monkeypox, but this past week, there's been all kinds of discussion about, oh, wow, well, we at least have a vaccine for it. But did anybody tell you that we have the capacity right now on a global basis to make about 10 million doses a year? That's it. And remember, it takes 2 doses to vaccinate somebody. That's 5 million people. My God, there's 100 million people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo alone.
Let's look at the institutional blockages here.
Sure.
Michael. Let's look at the Pentagon today. They're spending almost $1 trillion on the military budget, including the Department of Energy input. And that's over 50% of the federal government's operating budget. And the amount of money spent for almost certain approaching pandemics is a fraction of that. We have as a society a cultural aversion to foreseeing and forestalling omnicides. I mean, look at the attitude, how prolonged it is and full of doubt and misinformation on climate disruption and lack of preparedness. Now, if you were a president, how much would you spend on public health to foresee and forestall pandemics? Never mind other public health issues, of course, but just the area that you're working in, given what is being spent for the military-industrial complex. And you do talk about, in your Foreign Affairs article, about the military model, which I'd like you to elaborate. But give us a dollar figure compared to what's being spent now.
I believe that we could use, and I say use, I want that very clear, because this means that it's really for an achievement that's measurable. It's not just, oh, let's pad our budgets, okay? We could easily spend 5-10 times more than we're doing right now, which still would be a under cost. We're talking $5 to $10 billion a year in influenza vaccine research and development, the same with COVID, with the coronaviruses. On top of that, we then would have to spend, I believe, which could be, equal to that amount on developing capacity for quickly manufacturing these vaccines or drugs. I mean, it doesn't help to have a great vaccine if all of a sudden you need it and all you can do is make 10 million doses a year. And why is that? Because if you don't need the vaccine every day, who's going to try to keep that whole production capacity and manufacturing warm? Okay. Argue that, well, we should pay to keep it warm. And let me give an example. One of the most well-funded fire departments in the state of Minnesota is the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport Fire Department. Okay. One of the top three. They have never had a major plane crash on the reservation. 2 planes have gone down in Minneapolis in the 1950s, both of them handled by the Minneapolis Fire Department. Okay. We wouldn't run that airport for 5 minutes without that fire department there. And we pay for that every year because when we need it, we got to have it. We should be doing the same thing for vaccine manufacturing so that if something happens and we need those vaccines ASAP, we will have a place to do that. It may mean you'll have to build facilities, keep people trained, keep them on salary, and then at some point you need them, bam, you have it. We don't have that at all. Right now, we're to the whims of the private sector that make vaccines, and they're not going to invest in manufacturing capacity if it's not going to result in some kind of economic model that works. So I think both of those are huge issues. It's not just the amount of money. We're talking, as I said, 20 billion for manufacturing and for research on those 2 vaccines could basically over a period of 5 to 7 years could revolutionize our ability to respond. But you know what? Let me just say, my big concern is my own colleagues. When I got into the pandemic discussion early on, and you were well aware of this, I was seen as somebody who was way out there scaring the hell out of people needlessly. In March of 2020, I said, in the next 18 months, this pandemic could kill 800,000 Americans, okay? And you would have thought, basically, I saying blasphemy things about everyone's mother. I mean, it was not popular. Guess what? 18 months later, we hit 800,000 deaths in this country. And I think we have to give people a better sense of what could happen and hope that they believe it and saying that this is what could happen, because that wakes you up. Right now, there is no will in the public or among my colleagues either. In my own public health colleagues, they're beaten down, they're tired. They say, let's just move on. That is the perfect recipe for failure in the future. We got to learn from this. And if we learned from this, we would have found out what would have happened if we'd had these vaccines available before this happened. And we had much better protective vaccines. 1 dose and you're done. Think of what that could have meant to this pandemic. And so I think whether it's Congress, whether it's the public health institutions, whether it's the private sector, where the hell is the private sector? Meaning that look what it did to their companies. Look what it did to the economy. If this was an isolation, a threat like that, think how much they would spend to try to protect their company from this threat. And so I think it's across the board, Ralph. Congress is surely a part of it. The executive branch is part of it. The states are part of it. But all these other parties are also a part of it. And, at this point, there's no appetite for moving this forward.
Tell us about the Cuban initiative. Months ago, there was some information coming out of Cuba. They developed the vaccine and they were going to make it available very cheap to low-income countries all over the world. What's the latest on that?
Well, I wish I could tell you, but let me just tell you what I do know. I led a U.S. delegation to Cuba about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago, to look at their COVID vaccine products, their research. I was dumbfounded by the quality of the work and the kinds of results that they had and how they devised these new vaccines. And, I think it's been an absolute horrible shame that we haven't seen the Cuban vaccines really taken up around the world, and particularly among even countries like the United States. The data that I've seen from their studies, and it makes biologic sense. There's not A plus B plus C plus miracle here. They really did some novel things to amp up how these vaccines work. So I look forward to hopefully going back to Cuba in the not too distant future to do an additional assessment on these vaccines. But, as the United States, there's a type of bacterial meningitis, a bacteria that causes a brain infection, that for years we could not devise a successful vaccine for it. It was the Cubans that broke the mold. They did it. They figured it out. And now today, that's why we have a protective vaccine against that particular kind of meningitis. And so, to me, I have to say I was so impressed with their activities, their professionalism. And all I can say is I hope their vaccines do make it on the market.
Well, two quick questions on that. Are they getting published in peer review medical journals? And second, what suspended their plan to ship it to Africa and South America and Asia as they planned to do in 2021?
Yeah. Well, first of all, at this point, all I can say is that they're publishing some very important information. It has been published showing how well the vaccines work. So it's out there. And again, there's no reason to suspect that it's not exactly as they laid it out. It really is good vaccine. And when you understand the system they have there, they have a public health worker who lives in the neighborhood for about every 30 to 50 people. And that person is responsible for all the health issues of that 30 to 50 people. It is the most amazing public health army I've ever seen. So they could quickly vaccinate their population because of the trust that the public has in their government public health programs. In terms of what happened with shipping, I can't tell you for certain. They did ship vaccine off to a number of different countries. It was used. I don't know what the current status is with regard to that vaccine, but I would tell you right now, personally, I'd take it in a heartbeat.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Notwithstanding the quasi-embargo that the U.S. has imposed over the years on Cuba, the media here has done a lousy job in reporting what's been going on that you've just summarized for our listening audience.
Well, I'm very happy to report on that. And it's interesting that the other person who was very involved with this work going to Cuba, this mission from the U.S., now is the person who heads up the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at NIH. So this is someone who is very, very well informed on this issue about Cuba vaccines. So I think those of us in positions will continue to try to push this. And I might add that the Indians did a remarkable job too. They also came up with a vaccine technology. Again, it's not game-changing. It's not a universal vaccine, but at the same time, it is one that was very effective in its use in India.
Well, obviously, our society has a problem with avoiding masochism on a mass scale. We have invested hundreds of billions of dollars a year, much of it wasteful, corrupt, bloated, in a very intricate supply chain system to create weapons of mass destruction, weapons for death. We can't seem to get organized to create the equivalent weapons for life, which is why I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about what you mean when you say we have to adopt the military model in the area of heading off pandemics.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the military model in of itself is not some brilliant design that only the military knows how to implement. It's a mindset. It's the idea that you have to pay now or you'll pay later. And so that the resources they need are virtually guaranteed. The second thing is they know that funding this is an ongoing basis. You have to do it to keep, for example, if you're going to make a bomb and you order 100 bombs and they come, but you don't use them for the next X years, the place that made the bombs has to stay warm, because if you go into a war, you got to make bombs again. So they pay to keep that kind of production capacity warm. And we don't think about that in public health, that we may not need that vaccine right now, but we're going to need it in 4 years, and we're going to need a lot of it. And so I think that model of long-term investment with a long-term view, and the fact that funding this is going to take time, it's not going to happen overnight. And I think that, people mistook the whole mRNA vaccine technology as you did that in 6 months. That was based on 20 years of research that had been done, and it just got implemented during the COVID. And so I think the mindset we have to get to is long-term, and you have to keep the capacity warm. You can't go out and hire a fire department the day of a bad fire, okay? It just doesn't work. And that's what we typically do in public health, and we've got to change that.
Last quick question from a listener some weeks ago. There's a study that says when you go get a booster, one time do the booster in the left arm and then do the next booster in the right arm, and you get a longer cumulative effect. Do you agree with that? And are you worried at all about side effects?
I've seen those data, and I can't say that I'm convinced it is right, but it could be. It's very limited data. I mean, it makes some sense immunologically, but I would say that the overall impact of that vaccine is not going to be dictated by that.
And the last quick question, side effects. Enough research being done on the side effects of these boosters?
I think there is. We are carefully following them. It's a very public kind of situation where if somebody has anything happen to them after getting a dose of vaccine, even though life happens every day, and it may have nothing to do with the vaccine, I think we do have a lot of work going on in that area, and I'm confident in that.
And please give our listeners your website so they can get more information.
Sure. It's www.cidrap.umn, like the University of Minnesota, umn.edu.
Thank you very much, Michael. Again, a pleasure to get connected with you, and good luck to you.
Remember, you've been stuck with me for 50 years, man. Okay?
An honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Osterholm. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, Joe Biden may be retiring, but does he really need to be this much of a lame duck? We'll find out after we check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 30, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Civic leaders in East Palestine, Ohio, are calling on the federal government to do more to protect the long-term health and safety of its reeling residents. That's according to a report in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. In May, the Department of Justice and the Environmental Protection Agency announced a $310 million agreement with Norfolk Southern to hold the railroad operator accountable for the February 3, 2023 train derailment. If approved by a federal court in Ohio, the settlement would require the railroad to fund a community health program to address medical needs stemming from the disaster. It also requires the company to fund cleanup efforts. But local officials think the deal falls short. A letter signed by village manager Chad Edwards scrutinizes the lack of provisions for medical treatment, inadequate funding for health services, and other gaps. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Hannah Feldman, along with David Feldman and Ralph. And to close out today's show, Ralph, you had a call to action for our listeners.
After Netanyahu went to Congress and got 52 standing ovations, more than any other president has received, looks like the retiring Joe Biden is now retiring even from his futile admonishments of the war criminal Netanyahu. For example, right after Netanyahu came back, he became more intransigent and started issuing more conditions for a ceasefire. He increased his destruction in Gaza and just recently unleashed an unprecedented military assault in the West Bank, killing, marauding, blowing up infrastructure, attacking refugee camps, and it's all silent in the White House. In other words, Biden isn't even saying mildly he would like Netanyahu to obey international law, or he would like Netanyahu to open up the border for all the thousands of trucks with critical supplies of food, medicine, water, and other necessities of life for a starving, sick, injured population. So that's what we have now. We have a Joe Biden who is silent. And you know what kind of green light that gives to the war criminal Netanyahu. And part of it is due to the complicity of Congress, the lack of congressional hearings on the war, and the refusal even to have Israeli and Palestinian peace advocates of some prominence over the years to have a hearing, which they've never had since 1948. They've been blocked out by AIPAC. So I want to give the White House switchboard number, listeners, so you can generate your demand that Joe Biden start speaking forcefully before U.S. soldiers in the USA are dragged into a regional war, which is exactly what his extreme warmongering cabinet is scheming to do now with their expansion across borders. The White House switchboard number is 202-456-1414. Volunteers go to the White House regularly to receive these calls. and they actually tabulate them. How many are for this position? How many are against this position? So make your voices heard and demand that Joe Biden speak out forcefully for the interests of the USA, and listen to his wife, Jill, who in December, after seeing slaughtered children in Gaza, said to him, "Stop it now, Joe." The source for that comment is none other than Joe Biden himself. 202-456-1212. Please send the message.
I want to thank our guests again, Dr. Michael Osterholm. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesca DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember, to continue the conversation after each show, go to the comment section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode. We read them all.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. And the new Capitol Citizen, in print only, 40 pages, is out. You can get a copy by going to capitolcitizen.com, donate $5 or more, or you can find out how to get more copies for your own circle of civic activists. And there's a long interview of Jill Stein, the presidential candidate for the Green Party, and a major story on the enormous undercount of fatalities in Gaza.